Mixture could be explosive. Diversity, no strong source of religious authority, and a wave after wave of preachers from the East. Now, to understand this, you have to imagine that because we had been the frontier, all of our grandparents and parents were very concerned about us and our religious state out in the frontier regions. And so, because they were well-meaning, they sent preachers, and more, and more, and more preachers. Upstate New York was lousy with preachers. We had utopian communities. And my neighbors were always expecting the end of times at any moment. My neighbors had been expecting the end of times for some time, any minute, any time now. Millennialism was very popular when I was a child. Now, as a New Yorker and as a supporter of women's rights, I cannot help but be a little proud of Jemima Wilkinson. We hosted the first Women's Rights Convention. Impressive. She was the female Jesus Christ. Like Christ, Jemima Wilkinson began the most important part of her career by dying. Apparently, given her personality, this was an improvement. They laid her out and went through the ceremonies. Folks gathered dutifully and cried their insincere tears. Then, just as they were about to lower the coffin into the grave, she knocked. They felt compelled at this point to open the coffin, at which point she sat up. Apparently she felt much better, and she said, "Yes, I have passed through the gates of a better world, and I have seen the light. But they asked me to return to you, my brothers and sisters, a second Redeemer, to show you the way to salvation." As the public universal friend, she led a group of followers in a settlement in Dresden, near Ingersol birthplace on Cupid Lake, back in 1790. She was more charismatic in her second life than her first. At one point, before an audience of 1,000 believers and spectators, she stood on the shores of Seneca Lake and put her foot in the water and said, "Do you believe I can walk on water?" And her believers said, "Yes, we believe this." And she said, "Do you truly believe I can walk on water?" And they said, "Yes, we believe. We believe you can walk on water." And she said, "Then no further proof is necessary." There is also another group led by a woman. Mother Ann Lee was a British immigrant to New York. More importantly, she too, apparently, was a living embodiment of Christ. We were big on that too. The feminine incarnation of a bisexual God who led her people in commune, stressing the spiritual equality of the sexes. They were known for their chaste, simple, and industrious lives. While the largest Shaker settlement was in New Lebanon, New York, several other smaller settlements cropped up in the burned-over district. They were called Shakers because they actually shook with spirit during worship. In the rest of their lives, not so much. Men and women lived out their lives carefully separated from each other. Indeed, the ladies even rotated the responsibilities of tidying the brothers' rooms and cleaning their clothes, lest prolonged contact with a brother's underwear proved too overwhelming a temptation to sin. Given the separation, they could not increase naturally, if you will. So they grew their communities through conversion and adoption. Given the difficulties married women faced in these times, the drudgery, the endless childbearing, my own mother died during her last pregnancy. It was not an unattractive life. It was clean and simple and dignified. And I cannot neglect the Oneida community. Their story begins with John Humphrey Noyes, who, like many Yale divinity students in the 1830s, was particularly interested in the ideas of perfectionism. He that committeth sin is of the devil. He believed, not surprising. More surprisingly, when another student asked him, "Don't you commit sin?" Noyes answered, "No." Within a few hours, the word passed through the college and through the entire city. Noyes says he is perfect. Frequently followed by the observation, Noyes is crazy. Noyes was dismissed from Yale and relieved of his license to preach. Where do you go from there? New York, of course, where he began an affluent and commercially successful commune based on his interpretation of primitive Christianity. Life in the United Community was kind to women. In a time when married women had minimal property rights, in the United Community, property was held by all members. In a time when women's options in education and professional life were virtually non-existent, in the United Community, women were trained in a wide range of trades and crafts. Girls and boys studied the same subjects together. Women and men together made the decisions that shaped the community's communal life together. They experimented with labor-saving technology and dress reform to make women's lives easier. The United Community women wore the bloomer costume. In 1848, John Humphrey Noyes wrote of the more traditional women's garb, "Women's dress is a standing lie. It proclaims that she is not a two-legged animal, but something like a churn, standing on casters." All of this is fascinating, but most people are more interested in complex marriage in the United Community. All men in the United Community were married to all the women in the United Community. Monogamy was considered idolatrous. Now, this is not nearly as much fun as you would suppose. Of course, you would wonder how complex marriage works. Basically, when a man desired an interview with a woman, he arranged the meeting through a third party, generally an older woman. He was charged with maintaining what Noyes called male continence, to prevent conception except when the entire community agreed that such a consequence was desirable. Young men were only permitted interviews with women past childbearing age until they had mastered this technique. So this was not free love. It was highly controlled family planning on a grand scale. For Oneida perfectionists, the second coming was a state of mind. They looked to primitive ancient Christianity as a source of inspiration for utopian equality. Then there were the Millerites. After careful study of the Bible, William Miller became convinced that the second coming of Christ would occur about 1843. He visited Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Batavia, Auburn, Utica, Lockport, Ithaca, Niagara Falls, and many smaller places along the way. Needless to say, folks were irritated when 1843 passed without even a hint of Armageddon. As it turns out, it was a problem with the math. Miller recalculated to the precise date of October 22nd, 1844. Accepting his apologies for the error, thousands of followers prepared for the end. By the appointed time, the good people sold all their worldly possessions, then gathered on hilltops and haystacks to await the descending Savior. He might miss you if you weren't up high. It was a rather disappointing day. Foolish, insane, maybe. But when people are expecting the end of the world, they are willing to break long-standing rules. To a degree, following the Jacksonian individualism of the period, it was every soul for him or herself. Those who hung back could not expect to inherit the kingdom. Millennialism and perfectionism were everywhere. The traditional Protestant denominations played their part too, sending out their missionaries and their preachers. Irrigated by the Erie Canal, the churches grew up everywhere like weeds. In Palmyra, there's a church on all four corners of an intersection and one or two more nearby, just for good measure. You can't spit in upstate New York without hitting a church. Legions of circuit riders infested the region, and the greatest event was